You know what keeps Pentagon generals up at night. It's not Russian nukes. It's not Chinese hypersonic missiles. It's 17 obscure elements on the periodic table that most Americans have never heard of. And right now, China controls 90% of them. Let me paint you a picture. Every Tomahawk missile we fire, every F-35 fighter jet we fly, every Patriot defense system protecting our allies, they all share one critical vulnerability. And that vulnerability is sitting in warehouses in Beijing, ready to be weaponized at a moment's notice. Trump just slapped 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, the highest in nearly a century. And Beijing's response? They didn't yell. They didn't threaten. They just quietly paused rare earth exports. And that, my friends, is how you bring a superpower to its knees without firing a single shot. Now I know what you're thinking. Rare earths. Sounds boring, right? Wrong. These are the invisible ingredients that make our entire modern world possible. Your smartphone. Rare earths. Electric car earths. Wind turbines. Rare earth. And most critically, every single advanced weapon system in the American arsenal. You guessed it. Rare earths. Here's the thing that should terrify you. We're not talking about something we can substitute or work around. There is no plan B. Neodymium creates the super strong magnets that make jet engines work. Dysprosium makes those magnets work at high temperatures. Terbium powers our night vision systems. Without these elements, our military-industrial complex literally cannot function, and China knows it. Let me break down just how deep this dependency goes. A single Tomahawk missile needs over 900 pounds of rare earth materials. An F-35 fighter jet, 420 pounds. A Virginia-class nuclear submarine, 8,000 pounds. Now multiply that by our entire military inventory and you start to see the scale of the problem. And here's the kicker, even when we have rare earth mines in America, Australia, or Canada, we still have to ship the raw ore to China for processing. Because only China has the infrastructure, the technology, and the expertise to turn rocks into the refined materials we need. So we dig it up, send it to our biggest geopolitical rival, and then buy it back at a premium. Does that sound like a smart strategy to you? This didn't happen overnight. This is the result of 30 years of strategic blindness. Let me take you back to 1990. Back then, America was the world leader in rare earth production. The Mountain Pass mine in California was the largest supplier on the planet. We didn't just mine these materials, we owned the entire supply chain. But then something happened. Rare earth processing is dirty business. Extremely dirty, it produces massive amounts of radioactive waste and toxic chemicals. Environmental groups protested. Compliance costs skyrocketed. And by the early 2000s, we made a decision that would haunt us for decades. We shut it down. Now, I'm not saying environmental protection isn't important, but here's what we didn't consider. While we were patting ourselves on the back for cleaning up our backyard, China was building an empire. They moved the dirty work to Inner Mongolia, where regulations were loose. They subsidized the industry heavily, making their prices unbeatable. And most importantly, they played the long game. Chinese strategists weren't thinking about quarterly profits. They were thinking about controlling the choke points of 21st century power. And Western corporations, they were thrilled. Rare earths from China cost 50% less than producing them domestically. CEOs got bonuses for cutting costs. Shareholders were happy. Nobody wanted to think about national security because, hey, the Cold War was over. Fast forward to today, and we're living with the consequences. China controls 90% of global rare earth processing. Not mining processing, that's the crucial distinction. Because even if we dig up rare earths in our own backyard, we're still dependent on Chinese factories to turn them into usable materials. And now Trump has pushed the button on a full-scale trade war. 60% tariffs. That's not a negotiating tactic, that's economic warfare. And Beijing's response has been surgical. They're not banning rare earth exports outright. That would be too obvious, too aggressive. Instead, they're creating uncertainty. Pausing shipments here, delaying permits there. Just enough to send a message: we can paralyze your defense industry whenever we want. The impact has been immediate. Rare earth prices have spiked 40% in just a few weeks. Manufacturers of high-performance magnets in the US and Europe are sounding alarms about supply shortages. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, all of them are scrambling. And here's what really keeps me up at night. This isn't just about making new weapons. It's about maintaining and upgrading the weapons we already have. Think about that for a second. We have the most advanced military on Earth. Trillions of dollars in hardware. But if we can't get rare earths, we can't keep our existing weapons operational. Our massive defense budget means nothing if we can't source the raw materials to sustain it. And you know who's caught in the crossfire? Ukraine. Yeah, I bet you didn't see that connection coming. But think about it. Ukraine is fighting with Western weapons. Every day, they're burning through hundreds of missiles, thousands of guided munitions, dozens of air defense systems, all of which require rare earths to function. NATO countries have already given Ukraine most of their stockpiles. Now they need to replenish. But to manufacture replacements, they need rare earths. And to get rare earths, they have to go back to China, Russia's tacit ally. Do you see the absurdity here? We're indirectly funding both sides of the conflict. Western governments are sending weapons to Ukraine while simultaneously buying critical materials from China, which is supporting Russia through backdoor channels with technology and dual-use equipment. It's a geopolitical nightmare wrapped in irony. Some NATO officials have already started warning that if the war drags on another year, European weapons stockpiles could run dry. Not because they lack money, not because they lack technology, but because they lack the basic raw materials to manufacture anything. And China is patiently waiting for the moment when Europe has to choose between supporting Ukraine and maintaining their own defense capabilities. This is 21st century warfare, folks. No bombs, no invasions, just control of supply chains. And in this war, China is winning decisively, not because they have the most rare earths in the ground, actually they don't. It's because they're the only ones who know how to transform rare earths into power. So what's the West doing about it? Well, after years of sleeping, they've finally woken up. The U.S. passed the Defense Production Act, pledging billions to support rare earth mining and processing projects in America, Canada, and Australia. The EU launched the Critical Raw Materials Act, aiming to reduce dependence on China to below 65% by 2030. The numbers sound impressive, billions of dollars flowing in, old mines reopening, new technology being researched. But here's the reality check. The Mountain Pass mine in California has reopened. But they're still shipping their ore to China for processing because America doesn't have the refineries. The Linus project in Australia is facing fierce opposition from local communities worried about pollution. Processing facilities in Europe aren't expected to be operational until 2028 if everything goes smoothly. Meanwhile, China isn't standing still. They're increasing investments in rare earth mines across Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. They're buying stakes in mining companies in Canada and Australia. They're running faster to ensure that even when the West builds its own industry, China still controls the raw materials. Here's the brutal truth. The West is trying to build in 5 years what took China 30 years to perfect. Even if they succeed, they'll only meet 30 to 40% of domestic demand. The rest, still dependent on China, or on countries where China has significant influence. This isn't a race the West can win with money alone. This is about time, about political will, about accepting trade-offs. China was willing to sacrifice environmental standards, willing to invest at a loss for years to build their foundation. Is the West prepared to do the same? Or will they retreat again under pressure from environmental groups, high costs, and impatient voters? And this brings me to the bigger picture. If you still think power is about military might, about missiles and aircraft carriers, you're living in the 20th century. The 21st century is teaching us a different lesson. Power is about supply chains. We're witnessing the biggest power shift since the Cold War. Not because of who has more weapons, but because of who controls what others cannot live without. China doesn't need to fire a single shot to cripple Western defense industries. They just need to close a few valves. Rare earths are just one example. Look at semiconductors. Taiwan controls 90% of advanced chips. Look at lithium batteries. China controls 80% of production. Look at pharmaceuticals. China and India produce 90% of active pharmaceutical ingredients for the West. This is the new architecture of global power, a network of interdependencies but not balanced ones. Some countries hold critical choke points, and they know how to weaponize them without war. And the West is now facing an existential question. In a world where power isn't measured by military strength, how do you protect national security? How do you ensure strategic independence when everything depends on global supply chains? The answer isn't simple. It requires new thinking, new strategies, and most importantly, sacrificing short-term profits for long-term security. sacrificing convenience for independence, sacrificing economic growth for self-sufficiency. These are hard choices. Choices that democracies struggle to make because they require pain today for safety tomorrow. But here's what I know. The rare earth crisis isn't just a supply chain problem. It's a test of whether the West can adapt to the realities of the 21st century. It's a question of whether they can learn from 30 years of complacency, or whether they'll keep making the same mistakes with other critical industries. And more importantly, it's a reminder that in the modern world, real power doesn't belong to whoever has the biggest guns. It belongs to whoever controls what the guy with the big gun needs to load his ammunition. So let me leave you with this. Is this just the beginning of a larger crisis? Or is this the final wake-up call for the West to change before it's too late? Because one thing is certain. In this new game of power, whoever controls the supply chains writes the rules. And right now, the pen isn't in Western hands. Think about that. Let me tell you something that most people don't understand about this situation. This isn't really about rocks in the ground. This is about vision, about foresight, about understanding that the wars of the future won't be fought with tanks and planes alone. They'll be fought with control over the things that make tanks and planes possible. China saw this coming 40 years ago. When Deng Xiaoping said, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths," he wasn't making a geological observation. He was making a declaration of strategic intent. He understood that whoever controls these 17 elements would control the technological future of humanity. And he was willing to play a game that would take decades to pay off. Think about the patience required for that. Most Western politicians can barely think past the next election cycle. Chinese leaders were planning for generations. While we were focused on quarterly earnings reports, they were building an industrial empire that would take 30 years to complete. That's not just strategy, that's civilizational thinking. And now we're seeing the payoff. Every electric vehicle revolution needs Chinese rare earths. Every renewable energy transition needs Chinese rare earths. Every defense modernization program, you know the answer. China positioned itself at the center of every major technological trend of the 21st century. That's not luck. That's genius-level strategic planning. But here's what really bothers me about this whole situation. It was completely avoidable. We had every advantage. We had the technology, the capital, the expertise. We chose to give it away. And we gave it away for the dumbest reason possible. Because it was slightly cheaper and slightly more convenient. This is what happens when you let bean counters make national security decisions. When you let quarterly profit margins dictate strategic choices. When you confuse efficiency with resilience. We optimized ourselves right into dependence on our biggest rival. And now we're shocked that they're using that dependence as leverage. I want you to understand how deep this goes. This isn't just about rare earths. This is about a fundamental shift in how power works in the modern world. For centuries, power came from control of territory. Then it came from control of resources like oil and coal. Now it comes from control of the bottlenecks in global supply chains. And those bottlenecks are often invisible until someone decides to squeeze. COVID taught us this lesson with medical supplies. We discovered that we couldn't make our own masks, our own protective equipment, our own basic medicines. Now we're learning the same lesson with rare earths and semiconductors and batteries. We've built a house of cards where a disruption in one place can bring down entire industries. And the scary part, we're still not learning. Even as we scramble to build rare earth processing facilities, we're creating new dependencies on cobalt from the Congo, on lithium from South America, on graphite from, you guessed it, China. We're trying to solve yesterday's problem while creating tomorrow's crisis. What we need is a complete rethinking of how we approach strategic industries, not just throwing money at the problem, but fundamentally restructuring our economy to prioritize resilience over efficiency. That means accepting higher costs. That means building redundancy. That means keeping some industries on shore even when it's not economically optimal in the short term. But can we do that? Can democracies make those kinds of long-term strategic choices? Or are we too addicted to cheap consumer goods, too focused on the next election, too fragmented to execute a coherent industrial policy? I honestly don't know. And that uncertainty is what keeps me up at night. Because here's the thing. China is betting that we can't. They're betting that our system is too short-sighted, too divided, too committed to free market ideology to make the necessary changes. And so far they're winning that bet. Every day that passes without us building real alternatives is another day that their leverage grows stronger. The clock is ticking. And it's not ticking in our favor.